And we are here at last. The Unification Wars of Terror. How the Emperor united mankind under his rule. That's what we are looking at in a series of videos over the next few weeks. And we are going to kick things off with a bang when the Emperor fights the Maulland Sen Confederacy. We get some great insights into the Thunder Warriors, how they were both great warriors, but always had a riskier side to them, a lack of control, and why the Emperor targeted the Maulland Sen so early in his campaigns, what drove him. This is not terror under the Imperium, this is mankind after surviving the terrors of Old Night, where psychics wake and control others or become possessed by demonic beings. Gene looms once used by the Men of Gold to sculpt mankind now are used to unleash imprisoned terrors, and the advanced science of the golden age of technology now in the hands of dictators and tyrants. Think Thundar the Barbarian combined with Mad Max. One of the first foes the Emperor sought to vanquish in his quest to unite terror is the Maulland Sen Confederacy of States. The states had banded together during the worst years of anarchy. In those days, the weather satellites were all destroyed, and the winters had become punishing. Some form of association was required to avoid depopulation and death, just as in other areas of the globe, where the structures of civilization had degraded beyond recall. The Emperor's forces faced daily storms that would freeze equipment, and fires had to be lit under the transports he had so they could be used. This was in the early years of active expansion. The Emperor's plans had been in progress for decades by then, but he had not openly showed his hand in many areas. His stated territorial holdings were modest, enough to guarantee access to the materials needed and to impose a cordon around sites where research needed to be protected. Only when they were fully secured and his forces mustered in numbers could the Big E advance, without the stealth employed so far. Maulland Sen had been targeted by the Emperor, as it was full of abominations. He had been there in the past and wanted to eradicate the practices he had seen, yet he wanted the territory, but also to remove the taint of sorcery from terror. Sen represented that. It was a kingdom of witches at the roof of the world. A realm closer to a nightmare would be hard to imagine. It combined all that was worst about the Darkened Age. There was no law, no regulation of the powerful, no true science, a willful indulgence of excess and ignorance. They had retained scraps of knowledge and put them to foul uses, giving them a veneer of military might. But it was fragile and was already beginning to come apart, even as the Emperor's forces marched on the site. Maulland Sen was a place where some of the first major deployments were made of the Legione Astartes, along with what would become the Imperial Guard. The Emperor chose the Iron Lords, who became known later as the Iron Warriors. Even then, they were specialists in siegecraft. They had impressed the Emperor with how prepared they were, above the other legions, who at that time had not yet reached full battle readiness. The Imperial Guard was still being organised into divisions by climatic zone, for the dangers of the planet's weather were a major impediment to true global conquest, and the Emperor was able to call on cold weather specialists. The majority of the forces taken were equipped with suitable armour and had access to modified weapons. This wasn't a luxury, this was a necessity. Conditions were such that a human exposed to the elements without technological aid or other prescribed protective methods died within hours. There was also the Emperor's elite, the Legio Custodes, with them. Maulland Sen was a place of trial for the Thunder Warriors. The Emperor wanted to see if they could be as lethal en masse as they had already been in their smaller formations. Initially, the fighting divisions had been imagined as somewhat smaller than they eventually became, and thus the ranks were organised on orthodox regimental lines. The Primarch was equivalent to the Captain General rank in broad terms, responsible for the discipline and conduct of the entire Legio. The Primarch was not physically different to any of his troops, but had distinguished himself in combat and leadership, and was appointed directly by the Emperor. The Primarchs and their command groups naturally were given the best equipment they had. There were 20 of them in conception, one for each planned legio, although by that stage not all had been given the title. We have a name for the fourth, Ushatan. The enemy they faced was called the Priest King. It was a name he had given himself, one which was perfectly appropriate. His followers were fanatical, deranged by both combat narcotics and the delusions he fed them. They had laid hands on technology from the Forgotten Age and had learned or been shown how to use it. The Emperor's forces were fighting men stitched together into mockeries of the human form. Some were encased in machines and goaded into war with pain amplifiers. Most they encountered, to one degree or another, had been shaped into new forms, swapping their dignity for a feral kind of strength. The perimeter cities were conquered relatively quickly, for the taint of the priest king was lightest there, and the heartlands of the Confederacy had always been upland, up in the high peaks where the skies flew with shards of wind-blown ice. The Emperor's forces secured a beachhead on the southwestern lowlands and flew in heavy landers to anchor their supply routes north. They operated far from home, but had familiar advantages: technology, confidence, energy. After only a month, they were planning incursions further in. Due to the terrain, unenhanced warriors suffered high attrition rates, something that was hard to minimise. As they advanced north, many of them lost their minds. There were voices in the wind, and the cold was crushing. Those who died would be encountered again, ghosts in the gales, and it preyed on the nerves of the Emperor's line troopers. The Emperor would not have been able to continue had he only been able to draw on their service. This underscored the necessity of the gene-crafted detachments. The Thunder Warriors, we are told, were vital. To quote, "Terror could not have been conquered without them. We had fallen too far and let too many monsters use. They were the weapons that allowed us to advance into that ice-locked night." It was a hard fight even with the future master of mankind there. Every citadel was contested. Every offensive was met by a counter-offensive. The enemy knew the conditions. They knew the pattern of the landscape. They had nowhere to withdraw to, so they were desperate. With their backs at the wall, they fought harder. More than 7,000 gene-crafted shock troops died in the final assault. If you had been able to see them, oh how the Thunder Warriors fought, how committed they were, and how unrestrained in slaughter, you would appreciate the nature of what we faced there. Weaknesses displayed in Nordic had been addressed. All the armour used was now of ceramic and metallurgical alloys, rather than the steel plate and hardened leather worn before. Their blades are equipped with energy fields, and the bolt gun had replaced the old carbine and las rifles. At Maulland Sen, the levels of technology were roughly comparable. What set the Emperor's forces apart was their belief. The priest king had been hollowed out. His rantings were transparent, even to those who he had led into damnation. But the Emperor believed in his goals, and that set his forces apart from other techno-barbarians. But the Emperor's forces could feel a sickness. A Custodes comments on this. "We could all taste it. I have encountered similar sensations since, when fighting other enemies of allied origin. But then it was new to me. It generated little but disgust in me and my brothers. For the Thunder Warriors under Ushotam, it seemed to have a different effect. They thrived on it, at least for a time. They had, I surmised, the capacity to magnify whatever foulness they faced. That ferocity was useful, but it had weaknesses. The walls around the final stronghold had been constructed in the mountains. The fortifications were set high and were well defended, and they had prepared for us over many years. It was lit from behind by a greenish light, and its black walls gleamed. There was an art to its construction, but a twisted one. Every angle of its immense defences seemed to embody pain in one form or another. Set alongside the physical challenges, there was also the presence of other obstacles. The Custodes see that it might have been wiser to slow the pace of the assault, to limit our eventual casualties. But by then the Thunder Warriors were caught in a cycle of aggression. Death meant nothing to them. For a time it seemed that orders meant nothing to them either. They were elemental in their violence. The snow was piled up around the walls in drifts 10 metres deep. Its high battlements were lined with flame weapons. When the Emperor's forces assaulted and brought up their heavy guns, they created a flood of meltwater. They advanced through torrents, a grey sea of filth that found its way inside armoured seals. The tanks stalled and the electrical relays burst. They were reduced to infantry engagements faster than anticipated, and still the walls were intact. Ushitan made the first breakthrough, and there was great slaughter once he was inside. The forces of the Big E find not all the Priest King's people were corrupted. Some were slaves, and others might still have been salvaged for productive employment within the Imperium. In that, though, the Thunder Warriors demonstrated their greatest weakness. Once loosed, they were hard to control. They broke through the inner chambers like a tide, slaughtering all they encountered. They demonstrated then the sheer power of the gene-crafted soldier. The custodians after the battle spoke to Ushitan. After the citadel had finally been taken, its roofs broken and its walls pounded into rubble, it was by then far into the following night. An entire cycle had passed in fighting, and we had barely looked up to notice it. I remember how his armour was, covered in already freezing blood. Ushitan's helm was gone, and his arm was broken. A fresh storm had descended, and the battlefields were buffeted with new snow, covering up the tracks of grey slush we had exposed. Ushitan laughed when we met him. He had a vivid light in his eyes. I thought he looked like the ghost of all murders. What did he say? Someone asked. He told me that he understood, for the first time, the reason he had been made. He told me that I would never feel the same way, and that he pitied me for that. And now, the second excerpt, covering this battle, focused more on the Emperor and the aftermath. The future Emperor was there at Maulland Sen, in the hours before the Thunder Warriors met the Priest King's ravening hordes, armed in architect and anachronism, his armour as much baked leather and bronze as ceramite. He stood upon a high rock as the rising sun turned the eagles on his armour to virgin gold. His army stood to the south, occupying the low ground. The march to the enemy would be uphill, moving to ascend the rocky inclines, in whatever formation they could hold. To the north were the enemy, a horde of branded zealots and dirty wildlanders on the plateaus of their last mountain fastness, cladding motorised plate armour and cloaked in poorly cloned furs to brace against the cold. Lumbering brutes fleshed out their numbers, more evidence of gene forging gone awry with witchery instead of vision. They would bleed. At last, with the fall of Maulland Sen, Nordic would be brought to heel. The Emperor had looked down upon the armoured ranks closest to him, crudely armoured warriors in patched and remade suits of damaged ceramite. The campaign had been a long one, far more gruelling than predicted. His forces at the final battle were outnumbered by 7-1, though such numbers would mean nothing come the dawn. The enemy's high walls meant equally little, and the treacherous ascent to lay siege meant the least of all. The Emperor's army would sustain casualties, as every army always did, but sacrifice was bred into their bones. Victory would be theirs by the day's end. The lives beneath his banner were there to be spent in the purchase of peace. The warriors closest to the Emperor, a mere 30 souls, with Sagittarius among them, wore layered precious Oromite gold, reflecting the warlord's own war gear. In the years to follow, their trappings would become cloaked in red and bulked by additional plating, but as they stood at Maulland Sen, they wore half-suits of sacred gold, and the men themselves were a jewel at the army's vanguard, guarding their master. Their war banner was the eagle's head of their royal lord, crossed by 4 bolts of lightning. Beyond the custodians were the ranks of the proto-legionaries in their grim, battered plate. But not yet, not today, not in the morning of Maulland Sen. Here they would lose 7,581 warriors against the defiant tides of Maulland Sen's last defenders. He recalled how the Emperor ran a gloved hand through his wind-claimed hair, pulling it back from his dusky features. Wind had battered the crests atop the Thunder Warriors' helms. Sagittarius, the Emperor had said in a voice that carried above the drone of armour. Sagittarius, his helm adorned with a rearing eagle, turned to regard his liege and said, "My king?" The Emperor responded, "It is time. Your spear, please." Sagittarius offered it without hesitation, raising his spear for the warlord's reaching hand. The Emperor took the weapon, holding it fast in one gloved fist halfway along the haft, and lifting it high. He held it horizontally, ordering his men to hold position, as officers in the Bronze Epoch and the Iron Era of Old Earth had done in the centuries before, radio-oracle systems and Vox networks that would follow. Sagittarius felt the army shift, their focus tightening as they turned their attention to the Emperor, watching, waiting. There was no speech, for the army had its orders set in stone the night before. There was no curse or oaths, for those had already been given and made before the horde assembled. The Emperor said nothing at all. He signalled the advance, punching the horizontal spear 3 times towards the lightning sky. And there he remained, as the regiments of the Thunder Legion shook the earth beneath their marching boots, advancing up into the foothills. His own guard of 30 custodians waited with him, as did a host of banner bearers, aides, runners, attendants and advisors, each with their own stewards and guardians. Sagittarius watched the disorganised tide of soldiers make their way up the inclines. Their chaotic advance was as far from the order of the Legiones Astartes as could be imagined, nor could they rely on the same arsenal of biological enhancements implanted within the true Space Marines. These hordes were forced to crush the techno-savages of the Unification Wars, no doubt, but against the alien breeds of the galaxy, the Thunder Warriors would have been annihilated. The Emperor was paying scant heed to the battle's opening, his patient gaze resting on the higher peaks. From here, he could see the killing machines would soon rise. He handed the spear back to Sagittarius, who took it with due reverence. The Emperor checked the ornate bolter at his hip, one of the very first bolt guns, a progenitor for its kind, not a relic discovered from the Dark Age of tech, but an invention of the Emperor's own design. The Maulland Sen Confederacy was Nordic-based and served dark gods, and so was a ripe target for the Emperor's mission. The Emperor walked, cloaked against the cold. He held a sword dull in deactivation. Battle was around him. From the churned earth of shell craters to the remains of warriors on both sides, he walked between the bodies, knee-deep and in their thousands, as the snow began to fall in a miserable grey spill. Around him, warriors in clanking, crushing armour plate strode among the fallen, dragging comrades from the corpse heaps and executing wounded foes with swift plunges of cackling chain blades. The Emperor paid heed to none of this. The theatre of a battle's aftermath held no claim on his attention. He walked on, stepping over his own injured men, who called for his aid, approaching a ring of his elite warriors. They guarded a lone grey-haired figure, clad in an unreliably cloned fur cloak. The captured man hugged himself against the biting cold, standing and a little hunched over from his wounds. He looked up as the Emperor approached. He smiled without showing bloody teeth. So this is how it ends. The Emperor stood still, saying nothing. The wind pulled at his long hair. The weak sun glinted in flashes from his lowered sword. Why? The captive asked bitterly. Why annihilate my people like this? Your people will be allowed to live on, replied the Emperor. Your army and you yourself could not. The Emperor of Terror, the grey-haired captive said, with a laughing sneer. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth. The wound in his gut was eating him alive. No, said the Emperor. The Emperor of mankind. The prisoner hawked blood onto the snow. Of mankind now. One nation wasn't enough for you, not even one world. So you'll take your cancerous touch to the stars. Your defiance is ill-placed, the Emperor replied. Arrogant beast, he wheezed through the ruination of his chest. Hubris beyond reckoning, madness beyond definition. The Emperor turned into the wind, narrowing his eyes as he looked across the ravaged battlefield. And yet victory. Tyrant, the captive screamed. Butcher of the enlightened. Spit sprayed into the evening air, steaming where it landed. Apostate, heretic. The Emperor endured this spittle, punctuated tirade with a quiet patience, somewhere between dignity and immunity. I bring illumination, he said. You bring damnation, the captured warlord raged. I warned you, priest, said the Emperor. Long ago I warned you. We stand here now because of the choices you made. I pissed on your warnings then, the captive snapped back, and I piss on your enlightenment now. Let the sword fall. I go to my God's embrace, and with my last breath I will curse the blood in your veins. One of the custodians encircling him moved forward, pounding the butt of his guardian spear into the side of the man's head. Though he pulled the blow, scarcely seeking to injure, let alone kill, it was enough to break the man's eye socket and burst the orb within, turning it into shattered jelly. The captive warlord went down into the snow, howling, clutching his savaged skull. Restrain yourself, Sagittarius, the Emperor said. The custodian hesitated, bowed his head to his master, then returned to the ranks. Much later, the Emperor himself speaks to one of the custodies, called Ra, about this moment. I met him long before he was the priest king, the Emperor said. He began as a holy man, a mendicant preacher, wandering the northern wastes, gathering untainted food and purified water, giving it freely to those in need. He claimed it was his calling, and that his God lived in his kindness. It was a calling, of course, a call that was answered by the beings of the Immaterium. They gave him the power to feed his beleaguered tribe and heal their ills, and his clan grew. When savage winters ate away at the other tribes, his clan sheltered beneath the protection of his power. He kept them fed, protected and unseen from the eyes of their hunting foes. Soon hundreds of men and women were huddling for warmth within his mercy, and offering their thanks to the God that he believed he served. Yet each miracle took more effort, more sacrifice. The end always justified the means. First of the conundrums were moral in nature. What does it matter if another clan starves, if it allows his tribe to survive? Soon enough the rituals grew more occult in order to achieve their ends. What is the murder of a rival, if that guarantees another 10 years of peace? What is the life of one child, if the offer of its bloody beating heart will ensure a monarch's immortality? Ra stared down at the kneeling, bleeding priest king. Gone were the gene abominations and witchcraft-marked men in their thousands that had formed his ragged armies. He was alone, moments from his breathing his last. Soon his sick blood would taint the Emperor's blade. Think of this man's clan, continued the Emperor. As a holy man, he had begun with offers of food and the promise of survival. Sensing his susceptibility, the warp darkened around the candle flame of his life's light. He prayed and the warp answered. Soon his people were too numerous to hide. Other tribes came for his clan's riches. This man, this revered holy man, led his people to the machines of the old ages, cloning and replicating and using gene-forged, flawed warriors to wage war for territory. The clan branded their own flesh and ran to war alongside these genetic brutes, crying up to the sky for the same power their overlord enjoyed. And how far they had fallen, committing any act in the belief of their own righteousness, all from superstition, all from ignorance, all because one charismatic man believed that the power that heeded his calls could be trusted. By the time he realized they could not, he believed himself powerful enough to control them, independent enough to resist them. What harm in one more gift if it allowed his clan to thrive? What harm in one more sacrifice if it ensured a strong harvest or victory in a coming war? And when it came time to die, what would be this powerful independent man do? Would he go silently into the ground? Would he slumber upon a funeral pyre? Or would he, for the good of his people, reach for longer life at any cost, because only he can lead them? Ra still stared at the defeated monarch. The custodian knew all there was to know from the archives. He knew of the barbarity practiced by the Maulland Sen confederacy. He had seen picked evidence of the bone pits, those Golgothan barrows. Every day of his adult life he had fought alongside other golden armoured warriors who had been there for the dismantling of the confederacy itself. The priest king could hardly have appeared less like his treacherously magnificent depictions, with his red robes of office reduced to scorched rags hanging at the edges of his broken armour, and the cloak of clone fur blackened from flaming burners. The great demagogue stared up at the Emperor with the unshattered half of his face dirtied by blood and matted hair. Behind him the custodies seized something. Talons rippled in the shadows, cast by the man's cloak, glassy and obsidian, impossibly liquid in their caress. Claws clicked and scratched against one another. Inside, the wide pupil that looked like a hole drilled into the yellowing white of the priest king's remaining eye. Bulges wormed their maggoty way through the man's veins, bubonically swollen. The defeated warlord, this impoverished and humbled ruler, was riven from within. Then, with the sudden crack of an aggravated power field, blood sizzled on the Emperor's blade. The priest king's headless body toppled, neck stump steaming into the dirty snow. Sagittarius gripped the severed head by its long hair, holding it up for the miserable sky. He roared, and thousands of thunder warriors roared with him. The Emperor cleaned and deactivated his blade on the dead man's cloak, then sheathed his sword across his back, and the Emperor rested an armoured boot on the priest king's head. Knee servos thrummed. He hesitated, for the span of a single breath, as all eyes fell upon him. Then the boot came down, grinding the trophy into the dirt beneath the snow. When he lifted his tread, nothing but wet red shards remained, stringy with slick hair. "Burn the body," said the Emperor. "Burn all their bodies." Thunder warriors came forwards, armed with flamers. And that is the second excerpt, and completes our coverage of the Maulland Sen fighting during the Unification Wars against the Master of Mankind. So, let me know what you think to this early victory for the Emperor with a comment, and if you like this video on Old Knight, why not try this one?